Some memories fade with the years, but others cling to your mind like steel hooks. They don't just leave scars, they change the rhythm of your heartbeat. That morning, I had no idea I was about to witness one of those scenes. A moment that would keep any human being with a trace of conscience awake for many nights after. My name is Michael Hayes, 58 years old, a former Navy combat medic. And I used to think I had already seen it all. During my years of service, I had witnessed wounds no one should ever have to bear, deaths that never should have happened, and cruelties so senseless they hollowed a man out from the inside. But what I saw that morning sent a chill up my spine and into the crown of my head like a live wire sparking against bare metal. I live alone on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon, where the Deschutes Range stretches out, draped in endless pine forests. Evelyn, my wife, passed away 3 years ago. After her funeral, the house drowned in a silence so heavy it felt alive. I kept only one habit from those earlier, happier days: a morning walk down the narrow forest trail. Evelyn used to call it her little path. And I still call it that, as if the name could keep her laughter echoing somewhere among the trees. That morning, the sun was already sharp. Early light poured down like thin blades, cutting through the branches, throwing jagged patches of gold across the dirt. The air was warm, heavy, thick with the resinous sting of pine and the dry dust that rises after a long spell without rain. On any other day, sunlight like that would have promised life. But not that morning. The strangeness didn't come from the sky. It came from the silence. No birdsong, no scurrying squirrels. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. A silence so dense it felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped in the middle of the trail, my hand tightening on the strap of my pack. The military had taught me, absolute silence is never harmless. It means something's wrong, and usually it means something's very wrong. When I rounded the bend beneath the wide arms of an old oak, I heard it. At first, just the faint scrape of metal against bark. Then a series of broken, ragged breaths, the kind that sounded like a living creature fighting for air. My skin prickled. That wasn't random. That was something bound. I moved faster, careful not to snap the dry twigs underfoot. And then the scene came into view and froze me in place. A Doberman puppy, no more than 4 months old, was tied tightly against the trunk. A frayed nylon rope looped again and again around his neck and belly, biting deep until angry bruises spread beneath the skin. Patches of flesh were torn open, dried blood matted into his once black and tan coat, dulled now in the sun. He stood trembling, legs wobbling as if they could give out at any second. But what stopped my breath wasn't the rope or the wounds. It was the stomach. His belly bulged unnaturally, swollen and rock hard, as if someone had forced a melon into his fragile frame. I didn't need to touch him to know. That wasn't food. It wasn't gas. It was something inside, an abscess, a tumor, consuming every inch of space. My combat medic's gut knew the feeling too well. It was the same thing that had killed too many war dogs right in my arms. A hot gust swept through, carrying the bitter scent of pine, the iron tang of dried blood, and the rank odor of a body left neglected too long. It caught in my throat, burned behind my eyes. At his feet lay a crumpled scrap of paper, its edges browned by the sun. The ink had blurred, but the words were still clear enough. Just a few, but colder than any blade. Won't make it through the week. I lifted my eyes to his. There was no panic, no pleading, just a flat, hollow emptiness. The gaze of a being who already knew no one was coming. I had seen those eyes before, inside medic tents on battlefields, where young soldiers wheezed out their last breaths knowing the medevac would never arrive. And now, that same look stared back at me from a puppy left to rot in the sun, body failing, belly hard as stone. I stood still, listening as his shallow, broken breath staggered against the pounding in my chest, and in that moment I understood. If I walked away, I'd be signing that note myself. I'd agree he wasn't worth saving. And I couldn't. I dropped to my knees, pressing them hard against the hot, dry soil beneath the oak. My hand trembled as I reached toward him. The puppy didn't flinch, didn't whimper. He just stood there, legs quivering like a thread about to snap. Each breath came in short, jagged bursts, slicing the air like a dull blade. Carefully, I slid my fingers into the narrow gap between the nylon rope and the raw flesh already slick with blood. The cord was so tight I could feel the raised veins straining beneath the stretched skin. I pulled my pocket knife from my side, the steel flashing in the sun. The pup blinked once, then closed his eyes tight, as if pain had long ago taught him silence was the only answer. I cut the rope loop by loop. One, then another. Each time the fibers snapped free, more blood seeped out, but his breathing eased just slightly. When the last coil fell to the ground, I tossed the knife aside, and my arms instinctively wrapped around him. God, he was light, terrifyingly light, like holding a sack of bones wrapped in rough skin. Then my hand brushed his belly, solid as stone. No softness of a full meal, no rise and fall of natural breath. Just a hard, unfeeling mass swallowing every inch of space inside. I knew exactly what it was. A massive abscess, an infected tumor. Death is hiding inside a body far too young. I pulled him close against my chest, wrapping him in the old navy jacket I still wore on my morning walks. The stale scent of sweat and dust mingled instantly with the iron tang of blood and the musk of neglected fur. He tilted his head, cloudy eyes locking onto mine. Not pleading, not accusing, just asking one quiet question. "Are you sure?" My voice cracked into a whisper. "Yeah, I'm sure." I rose and moved fast toward the pickup parked at the trailhead. With every step, I felt his small chest pressed against mine, his breath hot, fragile but present. His heart thudded slow and weary, yet each beat seemed to say the same thing. "Don't leave me." The truck gleamed harshly under the sun. I opened the passenger door and laid him down gently, still swaddled in the jacket. He rolled onto his side, eyes half closed, breaths thin and frayed like a strand ready to break. I pulled the seatbelt across his tiny frame, clicking it into place with hands that shook so badly I nearly missed the latch. I looked at him again. A puppy tied to a tree in the middle of the forest, belly hard as stone, a death sentence scribbled on a scrap of paper. Yet he was still alive when I found him. I couldn't believe that was a chance. I turned the key. The engine roared awake. The sound dragged me back into the present. I knew exactly where I had to go. The small clinic run by Dr. Hannah Foster. We'd once served together. I had watched her in field hospitals, hands stained red to the wrists, never shaking, not even when others stepped back. If anyone on this earth would not abandon a fragile life, it was Hannah. I steered off the trail, tires grinding over brittle dirt and gravel. Sunlight blazed against the windshield, forcing my eyes into a squint. My arm stretched across the seat, palm resting lightly over the pup's belly, as if to swear a silent oath. "I won't let what's inside you win." The clinic wasn't far, 15 minutes at most, but to me it felt like a lifetime. I kept glancing sideways. Each rise of his chest gave me a breath of relief. Each falter tightened my heart like a fist. Over the hum of the engine, I whispered, "Hold on, kid. I'll get you there in time." Finally, the weathered wooden sign came into view. Veterinary Clinic, Hannah Foster, DVM. The paint had long since faded, green turned gray, but the words still stood. The small building, tucked behind an old gas station, looked like nothing special, but I knew it had seen more miracles than any gleaming hospital I'd ever walked into. I killed the engine and lifted him from the seat. The jacket was soaked through with sweat and blood, heavy in my arms. As I pushed the door open, the bell above jingled, and the sharp scent of disinfectant rushed in, an old familiar smell of field tents where life and death lived side by side with every incision. Hannah looked up from a stack of charts. Her eyes met mine, then snapped to the puppy in my arms. I didn't have to say a word. She was already moving, crossing the room in quick strides. The blue in her eyes burned with horror, and the same steel determination I had seen 100 times in combat zones. I gave a small nod, my voice rough. Found him in the woods, tied to a tree. Belly's hard as stone. She pointed to the cold steel table. Put him here. Now. I laid him on the cold steel table. Raven didn't move. His eyes half closed, each breath shallow and broken like scissors tearing fabric. Hannah pulled on gloves and flicked on the overhead lamp. White light poured down, revealing every cruel mark the nylon rope had left behind. Her hands traced along his neck, down to his belly. When she reached the swollen mass, her movements slowed. The calm mask on her face tightened into something else. I knew that look. It was the look of a doctor who had seen more than anyone should. There's a large mass, Hannah murmured, her eyes fixed on Raven. Hard. Immobile. I'd guess a sebaceous tumor or some kind of infected cyst. It's pressing on the liver, the stomach, maybe even the heart. She looked up at me, and in her eyes was a truth she didn't bother to hide. Michael, this is high risk. He's too weak. The mass is too large. The infection has spread. If we put him under, the anesthesia itself could kill him before I even touch it. I stood in silence, staring down at Raven. His stone-hard belly rose and fell in shallow rhythm. A puppy who had never known the open sky, already carrying a death sentence inside him. Hannah's voice dropped lower. Most people would let him go, not out of cruelty, but because of the cost, the risk, and the odds, next to nothing. My hand clenched inside the pocket of my jacket. The rough fabric scraped my palm, a reminder that I was still here, still able to choose. I drew in a deep breath, my voice gravelly. I'm not most people. Our eyes locked, and Hannah gave the kind of nod I had seen in the service, the nod that meant when everyone else stepped back, two people stepped forward. All right, she said quickly, turning to her assistant. Prepare anesthesia, abdominal kit, IV antibiotics, move. The clatter of metal trays, the hiss of compressed air, a small mask lowered over Raven's muzzle. I rested my hand on his head, bent close, and whispered, Stay with me, kid. The fight isn't over yet. Michael. Hannah's voice cut through, firm. You can't be in here. But... She paused, her eyes softening. I'll come out the moment there's news. I nodded, throat too dry for words. I stepped out, the door shutting behind me, leaving only the steady rhythm of machines pulsing like distant drums. I sank onto the old wooden bench in the hallway. The narrow space reeked of disinfectant, the rubber tang of gloves, the cold bite of metal. It was the smell of field tents, of nights where life and death drew their lines with the slice of a scalpel. Only today, the one on that table wasn't a soldier. He was a puppy who had never tasted freedom. The beep, beep of the monitor echoed through thin walls, slow and steady like a war drum. I hunched forward, hands locked tight. In the service, I had counted seconds waiting for medevac, praying to hear that a buddy still breathed, but never had waiting clawed me open like this. The clock on the wall ticked heavily, stretching each second into torture. Sunlight streamed through the frosted glass, laying harsh gold streaks across the hall. I closed my eyes, hearing the ventilator hum, the scrape of scalpels against steel. Battlefield music I thought I'd left behind years ago. Then, suddenly, a long, flat tone split the air. Beep. My chest collapsed, as if crushed from the inside. I shot to my feet, but seconds later, the steady beep. Beep returned. I slumped back against the wall, forcing a deep breath, clinging to calm. 40 minutes bled out like 40 years. At last, the door swung open. Hannah stepped out, tugging her mask down, sweat glistening on her forehead. Her gloves were streaked dark with blood. "Got it out," she said hoarsely, voice steady. "Sebaceous mass, the size of an orange. The infection had started, but it hadn't reached the liver. I flushed, closed, and started antibiotics. The rest..." She met my eyes and stopped. "The rest is up to him. He has to want to live." I nodded. I knew better than most. Medicine could clear the path. But the walking, that was Raven's choice alone. The white glare of the recovery room stung my eyes as I stepped inside. The sharp reek of disinfectant, cut through with the smell of fresh blood and metal, dragged me back to the field tents of another life. Only this time, the one on the table wasn't a soldier. It was a puppy, his belly stitched tight with rough black thread. Raven lay on a thin heating pad, a small blanket draped loosely over his fragile body. White bandages wrapped his midsection. An IV line pierced his foreleg. The monitor pulsed weakly, each flicker echoing his faint heartbeat. His eyes were half closed, his breath so shallow I was afraid that if I looked away for even a moment, he'd be gone. I pulled a plastic chair close and placed my hand on his head. His fur was damp, cold beneath my palm. My voice cracked into a whisper. "You made it through the worst, kid. Now there's only one thing left. You've got to want to stay." For a long while, I just sat there, listening to the slow, steady beep of the monitor. Then I stood, stepping out briefly. When I returned, I carried a styrofoam cup of hot chicken broth I'd begged from the kitchen and back. In the service, I had sworn by it, believing that even the scent of broth could remind a body why it needed to live. I scooped a spoonful, cooled it, and held it near Raven's muzzle. Nothing. His eyes stayed shut. His breathing stayed thin as a thread. I didn't push, didn't plead. I simply held the spoon there, steady, though inside I was shaking. I whispered, "If you hear me, give me a sign. Any sign at all." A minute passed, then 2. The spoon grew heavier in my hand. My jaw locked tight, refusing to blink. And then, so slight I thought I imagined it. His nose twitched. A longer breath slipped out. And almost unbelievably, his tongue brushed the spoon. A trembling, feeble lick. Then stillness again. My chest clenched. Heat burned behind my eyes. These weren't sobs. Not the kind that break free in gasps. They were the kind of tears that run deep, silent. The kind you shed only when you've watched a fragile creature decide to fight the dark. The back door creaked open. Hannah stepped in, mask pulled down, sweat still glistening along her temple. She stood silent for a moment, then said softly, "You just did what medicine couldn't." I didn't answer. I only lifted the spoon again, and this time, Raven licked once more. Small, shaky, but certain. In that sterile room, beneath the cold halogen lights, we had just won the first battle. The next morning, I arrived early, before the clinic even opened. I dragged my chair beside the steel kennel and brought with me an old book Evelyn used to read to our dog in his final days. I didn't know if Raven could hear me, but I read anyway, letting the sound fill the room too heavy with silence. On the third day, when I stepped inside, one of his ears twitched. His eyes stayed closed, but his body recognized the sound of my steps. I sat down, held out the spoon of broth. This time I didn't wait long. He licked immediately, slow, weak, but deliberate. I looked up to find Hannah leaning against the doorway. She gave a small nod, her voice quiet. If he keeps this up, the odds will start to climb, but he needs you more than me. I understood. I had seen medicine save bodies, but only the presence saved souls. I began spending more hours there, mornings reading aloud, afternoons in silence, evenings with a few strands of shredded chicken, no pressure, no calls, just my steady presence so he would know he was never alone. By the 5th day, when I pushed open the recovery door, Raven's eyes were open, dark, deep, holding the faintest spark of light. I sat and placed a small bowl of thin porridge at his feet. He looked at me for a long moment, then lowered his head and ate, spoonful by spoonful, from my hand. And when the last mouthful was gone, I saw what I hadn't dared to hope for. His tail stirred, just a faint tremor, as though he wasn't sure yet if he was allowed joy. But for me, it was the first sign of trust, a beginning. And that night, when I stood to leave, he didn't turn away like before. He lifted his head and watched me until the door closed behind me. I started calling him Raven. I didn't know why, but the name came naturally, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The way his black and tan coat caught the dim light of the recovery room reminded me of a crow standing still against dusk, and the name stuck, marking the first imprint of a new beginning. In the days that followed, I learned to live in what I called whisper mode. No sudden sounds, no sharp gestures. Everything is slow, everything gentle. I let Raven decide the distance. If he wanted to curl up in the corner, I stayed quiet in my chair. If he drifted closer, I didn't stare or coax, just let my hand rest open on my knee, a silent invitation. The change came in the smallest things. One afternoon, as I shredded chicken into thin strips, I felt the lightest touch against my leg. I glanced down. Raven stood there, tail flicking softly. No fear, no hesitation. I set the bowl of food on the floor. He ate, and I stayed still, saying nothing. When he finished, he didn't turn away like before. Instead, he stepped closer, sat in front of me, and slowly lowered his chin onto my knee. That feeling. It's hard to describe. Just a faint weight, a quiet warmth seeping through the fabric of my pants. But to me, it was a bridge laid across a canyon, between life and death, between mistrust and a chance to begin again. I reached to scratch gently behind his ear and whispered, "Good boy, we're on the right path now." Hannah saw it the next day. She leaned against the doorway, smiling. "You're his anchor, Michael. Take you away now, and he'll drift back." I looked down at Raven, resting his head against my leg, and said softly, "I'm not going anywhere." 3 weeks passed. Raven was strong enough to leave the clinic, but my apartment was just a third-floor walk-up, no yard, no space for a puppy who needed to relearn the world. Each time we went out, I carried him down the stairs, 12 steps at a time, careful not to strain the stitches across his belly. He stayed quiet in my arms, head pressed against my chest, heartbeat quickening whenever we reached the door. One night, after carrying him back up, I found Raven standing at the window, staring down at the patch of grass under the street lamp. That look wasn't just curiosity, it was longing, a need to touch the world outside. My chest tightened. I understood then, If I kept him trapped in that small room, I was no better than the one who tied him to that tree. Only this time, the rope would be invisible. That night, I opened my laptop. The blue glow lit my face in the dark room as I typed, "House for rent." Bend, Oregon, fenced yard. Dozens of listings appeared. I narrowed them down, weighed the little I had left in savings, weighed my age, my limits. But in the end, I knew I had no choice. 3 days later, I signed the lease on a small wooden house at the edge of town. The green paint was faded, vines dead along the porch, the lawn grown up to my knees. But to me, it was perfect. A fenced yard, no cars, no noise, a place where a puppy who had clawed his way back from death could learn how to run again. On moving day, I set the last box down on the floor. Raven stood at the back door, staring out at the grass, his eyes locked on it like it was something sacred. I opened the door, slipped off the leash, and crouched to touch his shoulder. "Go on, little warrior." At first, he stepped cautiously, nose working over each blade of grass, ears alert, tail low. Then, like a switch thrown, Raven burst forward, fast, steady, without the slightest hesitation. He circled the yard once, then again, and again, as if mapping the borders of a world he could finally claim. I stood watching, eyes fixed on every stride. Sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across his glossy coat, painting golden edges along each bound. And for the first time, I saw Raven whole. Not the trembling puppy tied to a tree, not the hollow-eyed creature waiting for death. He ran as if he believed, at last, that this time he was allowed to stay. The days in the new house passed slowly, but they were full. Every morning, Raven waited at the back door, eyes shining as if each sunrise was a gift. Every afternoon, he lay beneath the wooden porch, chin resting on the step, eyes half closed, ears tuned to the whisper of wind threading through the pines. And I would sit in the old wooden chair, listening to his steady breathing, feeling something in my chest finally settle after years of emptiness. I thought life would simply carry on that way. Simple, quiet, whole. But one late autumn morning, Raven did something that stopped me cold. I was clearing the small shed behind the yard, stacking the cartons left from moving day. I bent down to shift a box and heard a rustle behind me. Turning, I saw Raven. His jaws held a crumpled piece of paper, its edges yellowed by sun, stains of old moisture spreading across it. He walked slowly toward me, eyes fixed on mine, and dropped the paper at my feet. He didn't bark, he didn't wag his tail. He just stood there, silent, watching. I knelt. My heart thudded as my eyes ran over the blurred but unmistakable words. "Won't make it through the week." It was the note, the death sentence someone had tied to him beneath that oak tree. I had thought I'd buried it in an old box, sealed it away with the past. Somehow, Raven had found it, and brought it to me. I looked up into his eyes. They weren't hollow anymore. They weren't empty. They held something else now, a strange calm, as if he was telling me, "We beat this." I drew in a long breath and nodded. "All right, kid, time to finish it." We stepped out onto the porch. Late autumn sunlight filtered through the branches, painting the yard in warm gold. I opened the drawer by the door and took out Evelyn's old lighter, the one she'd always carried on camping trips. Paper in one hand, lighter in the other. "What should we do with it, Raven?" I asked, half a question, half a ritual. Raven stepped forward, placing one paw on the corner of the paper, then lifted his eyes to mine. Steady, deep, certain. I understood at once. The flame sparked, eating into the paper's edge. The blurred ink shriveled, the cruel words collapsing into ash. I held it until nothing remained but thin, fragile embers, then let it go. A breeze carried the ashes into the air, scattering them into nothing. I placed my hand on Raven's head. Warmth from his body flowed steadily into my palm, as firm as a heartbeat. "This," I whispered, watching the last flecks of ash vanish, "never gets to define you again, not ever." That afternoon, I printed a photograph. Raven's first run in the yard. Ears high, eyes bright, mouth open in something close to a grin. I framed it and set it on the wooden shelf by the door. Beneath it, I wrote one line by hand: "Absolutely worth saving." That night, I sat in the old armchair with a book in hand. Raven came over, circled once at my feet, then climbed onto my lap, curling himself as though it were the safest place in the world. His head rested on my chest, his breathing steady and warm. I stroked behind his ear, feeling the softness of his fur beneath my fingers. A single tear slid down into the black of his coat. Not out of sorrow, but gratitude. Grateful that I had been there at the right moment. Grateful that he had chosen to stay. Gratitude that in a world often so cold, there are still moments strong enough to pull a life back from the dark. And in that moment I knew. Both Raven and I had stepped across the final threshold of shadow. The days that followed found their rhythm. Each morning, I opened the back door, and Raven burst into the yard, his long legs stretching strong, ears high, sunlight painting gold along the edges of his black coat. He ran wide circles, breathing deep, then stopped to lift his head toward the sky, as if to make sure he truly belonged to this place. In the afternoons, he stretched out beneath the porch, eyes half closed, breathing steady. I sat in the old wooden chair, coffee cooling in my hand, yet my heart was warm in a way I hadn't felt in years. At last, the house carried life in its corners again. No longer the echoing silence of Evelyn's absence. Now another heartbeat filled these rooms. Small moments carried weight enough to move me. Like the evening I read from Evelyn's old book, and Raven climbed onto the chair, curling against me, his head on my chest. His breathing is steady, warm, and for the first time in years, the heaviness inside me lifted. No longer a hollow space, just life, pulsing in rhythm with my own. One night, I stood before the framed photograph on the shelf. Raven, in his first run, ears flying, eyes bright, mouth open in a smile. Beneath it, the words "I'd" written. Absolutely worth saving. And it struck me. That line wasn't only for Raven, it was for me. Because while I thought I had saved him, the truth was, he had saved me from a darkness I hadn't even known I was drowning in. I remembered that first day in the woods, staring at the cruel words scrawled on a scrap of paper. "Won't make it through the week." Someone had decided his life wasn't worth fighting for. But here he was, alive, running, loving, teaching me that the worth of a life is never written on a piece of paper left to rot. That night I wrote in my journal, then paused, watching Raven asleep. And I thought, there must be more lives out there waiting for someone to stop, someone not to turn away. And I asked myself, if not me, then who? I knew I couldn't change the whole world, but I also knew I had changed Raven's. And sometimes that's enough. If you're listening to this, I want you to understand one thing. When you save a life, whether it's a trembling puppy, a frightened cat, or a human soul losing hope, you're not only saving them, you're saving yourself. Because each time you do, you remind your own heart it can still feel, still love, still fight back against the indifference of the world. I laid my hand on Raven's head, warmth pulsing steadily beneath my palm. He didn't open his eyes, just shifted closer, burrowing deeper into my chest. A long, quiet breath escaped his body, and in it I heard a reminder. We chose to stay. And I whispered back, like a promise, "Yeah, kid, We've got more days left to live. Outside the window, the late autumn wind stirred the pines. I knew somewhere out there other ravens were waiting to be found. And maybe all it takes is one person to stop, one person to say, "I'm sure," and another life will be saved. I hope next time that person will be you. My story with Raven ends here. But the lives that need saving do not. If this journey touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share this story so more people will know no life is ever not worth saving. And if you believe as I do, that every life deserves a second chance, hit subscribe and join us in bringing more stories of rescue and hope. Because who knows? One day, it might be you who stops and changes the entire world for a small, fragile soul.